The grand hall of the city conservatory was busier than usual. Workers moved decorations from one side of the room to the other. Students hurried through the long hallways carrying music sheets. Teachers discussed schedules while volunteers arranged tables for the upcoming fundraising gala. It was the biggest event of the year. Important guests would attend. Wealthy donors would be there. Local reporters had already started talking about it. Every student wanted a chance to impress the audience. Near the center of the hall stood a beautiful black grand piano. Its polished surface reflected the bright lights hanging from the ceiling. Several students gathered around it during a short rehearsal break. Some were practicing difficult pieces. Others were simply talking and laughing. Among them was a young piano student known for her confidence. She had won several competitions and was expected to perform during the gala. Many people admired her talent, but some felt she could be a little too sure of herself. That afternoon she seemed especially relaxed. The rehearsal had gone well, and her friends surrounded her, chatting about the event. "Everyone is already saying you'll be the star of the evening," one student said. She laughed. "Let's hope they don't expect too much. You never make mistakes." "That's not true." "Then name the last time you missed a note." The group laughed together. As they talked, an older man quietly pushed a cleaning cart across the hall. Most people barely noticed him. He wore a simple work uniform and moved slowly as he cleaned the floors. His gray hair showed his age, and his face carried the calm expression of someone who had spent many years working hard without asking for attention. Every student knew him. He had worked at the conservatory for years. He unlocked rooms in the morning, cleaned classrooms at night, and always greeted people with a friendly smile. Yet very few students knew anything about him beyond his job. To them, he was simply the janitor. As he cleaned near the stage, one student suddenly pointed toward him. Maybe he should perform at the gala. The group burst into laughter. Another student joined the joke. "Yes, give him the opening act." More laughter followed. The older man heard them but continued sweeping quietly. Then someone said, "Maybe he can play the piano better than all of us." The group laughed even harder. The confident young pianist looked toward the janitor and smiled. The comment seemed harmless to her. She walked closer to the piano and folded her arms. "If you can play this piano," she said jokingly, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "I'll marry you." The room exploded with laughter. Several students nearly doubled over. One covered his face while laughing. Even a few volunteers nearby smiled at the joke. After all, nobody believed the janitor could play. The older man paused. For a moment, the laughter continued around him. Then he slowly lifted his eyes toward the piano. Something changed in his expression. It lasted only a second. The smile on his face faded slightly. A distant look appeared in his eyes, as if he were remembering something from a long time ago. Then the expression disappeared. He simply smiled again. "That's very kind of you," he replied softly. The students laughed once more. The young pianist grinned. "See? Even he knows it's impossible." The janitor nodded politely and returned to his work. Within minutes, the conversation moved on. Students began discussing their performances again. Teachers called everyone back to rehearsal. The joke was forgotten almost immediately, at least by most people. But not by everyone. One student standing near the back of the group had noticed something strange. It wasn't the joke. It wasn't the laughter. It was the way the janitor had looked at the piano. There had been something unusual in his eyes. Not embarrassment. Not anger. Not even sadness. It looked more like longing. As if the instrument meant something important to him. The student watched him quietly for the rest of the afternoon. Several times the janitor passed through the hall carrying supplies. Each time he walked by the piano, his eyes seemed drawn toward it. Not for long, just a glance. But it happened every time. The student couldn't stop thinking about it. Later that evening, after most people had gone home, the conservatory became quiet. The large hallways echoed with distant footsteps. Only a few lights remained on. The janitor continued his work as usual. He emptied trash bins, cleaned rehearsal rooms, and organized supplies for the next day. Nobody paid attention. Nobody noticed that he paused briefly outside the main hall. The grand piano still sat under the stage lights. The room was completely empty. For several moments he simply stood there, looking, remembering. The silence around him felt almost peaceful. Then he slowly stepped inside. His footsteps echoed softly across the floor. When he reached the piano, he stopped. His hand rested gently on its polished surface. A faint smile appeared on his face. The kind of smile people wear when they remember something precious. Something they never truly forgot. The hall remained silent. No audience. No applause. No cameras. Just him and the piano. After a few moments he removed his hand. He took a slow breath and turned away. His shift was not finished yet. There was still work to do. The next morning the conservatory buzzed with activity once again. Students rushed between classes. Teachers reviewed schedules. The gala was only days away. The young pianist continued preparing for her performance. She barely remembered the joke from the previous day. To her, it had been nothing more than a funny moment. Yet the student who had noticed the janitor's expression could not let it go. During lunch break, he found himself sitting near the older man. The janitor was eating a simple sandwich by himself in a quiet corner. Most students passed by without saying a word. The student hesitated for a moment before approaching. "Mind if I sit here?" The janitor smiled. "Not at all." The student sat down. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then he asked, "Do you like music?" The question seemed random, but the older man didn't look surprised. Instead, he smiled warmly. "Very much." The student nodded. "What kind of music?" The answer came immediately. "Classical music." The student raised an eyebrow. "Really?" "Of course." "Who's your favorite composer?" Without hesitation, the janitor named several composers. Not just their names. He spoke about their styles, their struggles, and the emotions behind their music. His knowledge was detailed, far more detailed than expected. The student listened carefully. The conversation continued for nearly 20 minutes. The more they talked, the more surprised he became. This wasn't casual knowledge. This was the kind of understanding possessed by someone who had spent years studying music. When lunch ended, the student walked away feeling puzzled. Who exactly was this man? A janitor who understood classical music better than many students? A janitor who looked at a piano as if it held a lifetime of memories? A janitor who smiled politely whenever people joked about him? Something didn't add up. For the first time, curiosity began spreading through the conservatory. And without realizing it, a simple joke made in front of a piano had started uncovering a mystery hidden for many years. A mystery that would soon change the way everyone in the conservatory saw the quiet old janitor forever. The days leading up to the gala became even busier. Every room in the conservatory seemed full. Music drifted through hallways from morning until evening. Some students practiced difficult piano pieces. Others prepared violin solos or vocal performances. Teachers moved from room to room offering advice and making last-minute corrections. Everyone focused on the upcoming event. Everyone except one student. His attention kept returning to the quiet janitor. The conversation they had shared during lunch refused to leave his mind. The older man knew far too much about music. Not just the names of famous composers. He spoke about performances, techniques, and emotions in a way that sounded personal. It was as if he had lived inside that world himself. The student tried to forget about it, but curiosity kept growing. 2 days later, he spotted the janitor cleaning outside a rehearsal room. "Good morning," he said. The older man smiled. "Good morning. You seem busy." "A little." The student hesitated. Then he asked, "Have you always worked here?" The janitor leaned lightly on his mop. "No, not always." "What did you do before?" For a brief moment, the older man's eyes drifted toward a nearby window. Then he smiled again. "A lot of different things." The answer sounded polite but incomplete. The student noticed. Still, he didn't push further. They talked for a few minutes before parting ways. But the mystery only became stronger. That evening, after finishing his practice session, the student visited the conservatory library. The library was nearly empty. Most students preferred practicing rather than reading old books. He sat at one of the computers and typed a simple search. The janitor's name. First, nothing appeared. Just employee listings and routine records connected to the conservatory. He almost gave up. Then he found an old local newspaper archive. The article was more than 30 years old. A faded photograph appeared beside the headline. The student leaned closer to the screen. His eyes widened. The man in the photograph looked remarkably familiar. Much younger, darker hair, a formal suit, but unmistakably the same face. His heart started beating faster. The headline described a rising concert pianist receiving praise from critics across the country. The article spoke about sold-out performances and standing ovations. It described a musician many believed would become internationally famous. The name beneath the photograph matched the janitor exactly. The student stared at the screen in disbelief. "No way," he whispered. He opened another article. Then another. And another. Each one told a similar story. The pianist had performed in major concert halls. Music magazines praised his talent. Reviewers described him as one of the brightest young artists of his generation. Yet suddenly the article stopped. One year there were dozens of reports. The next year there were none. It was as though he had disappeared. The student spent another hour searching. Eventually he found a final article. Unlike the others, this one carried a much darker tone. It briefly mentioned a serious car accident. The report offered very few details. Only that the musician had suffered injuries and withdrawn from public life. No future performances were scheduled. No interviews followed. Nothing. The story simply ended. The student sat silently. The pieces were starting to come together. The janitor was not just someone who liked music. He had once been a musician himself. A very successful one. The discovery felt unbelievable. The next morning he shared the articles with two close friends. At first they laughed. "You're serious?" "Completely serious. That's impossible. Look for yourself." They studied the photographs. Slowly their expressions changed. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. Soon the story began spreading among a small group of students. Whispers appeared between classes. People started paying more attention whenever the janitor walked by. Some were skeptical. Others became fascinated. Meanwhile, the young pianist who had made the original joke knew nothing about it. She remained focused on her rehearsals. Her performance piece was difficult, and she wanted everything to be perfect. Still, she began noticing strange behavior. Students stopped talking when she approached. Several seemed distracted during conversations. Finally, she asked what was happening. One of her friends showed her the newspaper articles. She stared at the photographs. At first she thought it had to be a mistake. Then she compared the pictures more carefully. The similarities were obvious. The same eyes, the same smile, the same facial features. Her confidence faded slightly. "You think that's him?" "We're pretty sure." The young pianist looked down at the article again. For the first time since making the joke, she felt uncomfortable. She remembered how everyone had laughed. She remembered assuming the janitor knew nothing about music. Suddenly the memory wasn't funny anymore. Later that day she spotted him cleaning near the auditorium. For a moment she considered walking away. Instead she approached. "Excuse me." The older man looked up. "Hello." She hesitated. The words felt awkward. "I wanted to ask you something." "Of course." She held up a printed copy of the article. His eyes immediately recognized it. A small silence followed. Neither spoke. Then he smiled gently. "You found that. So it is you?" The janitor nodded. The answer surprised her even though she already suspected it. "You were really a concert pianist?" "I was." The simplicity of his answer made it feel even more real. She looked at the article again. "I don't understand." "What part?" She glanced around. "How does someone go from this?" she said, pointing at the photograph, "to working here?" The older man remained quiet for a few moments. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm. Life doesn't always follow the plans we make. The answer carried more weight than she expected. For some reason, she didn't ask any more questions. Instead, she lowered the paper. I think I owe you an apology. The janitor smiled. For what? For what I said the other day. He shook his head. There is no need. But everyone laughed. People laugh every day. I shouldn't have said it. The older man looked at her kindly. We all make assumptions sometimes. His response surprised her. There was no anger, no bitterness, no desire to embarrass her, only kindness, that somehow made her feel even worse. As the days passed, curiosity continued spreading throughout the conservatory. More students learned about the articles. More questions appeared. Some wondered whether the stories were exaggerated. Others questioned whether he could still play. After all, decades had passed. Being talented years ago didn't mean he could still perform today. One afternoon, a small group gathered near the cafeteria discussing exactly that. Maybe he forgot. You don't forget piano. After 30 years? Maybe. I still don't believe he was that good. The conversation continued. Unknown to them, a retired music professor happened to be walking nearby. He overheard part of the discussion. When the students showed him the article, his reaction shocked everyone. His eyes widened immediately. I remember him. The students exchanged surprised looks. You do? Of course I do. The professor took the newspaper clipping. He was extraordinary. Seriously. Very seriously. The professor studied the photograph. For a moment he seemed lost in memory. I attended one of his performances many years ago. What was he like? The professor smiled. The kind of musician people don't forget. The students listened carefully. He had a rare gift, the professor continued. Not just technical skill. Many people have technical skill. He could make people feel something. The group fell silent. The professor handed back the article. If he truly is working here, then you're standing in the same building as someone very special. The words spread through the conservatory even faster than the newspaper articles. Now the mystery felt larger than ever. Students began watching the janitor differently. Teachers greeted him with new respect. Even staff members seemed surprised. Yet the older man himself behaved exactly the same. He still arrived early, still cleaned classrooms, still carried supplies, still smiled politely, as if none of the attention mattered. But one question remained unanswered. Could he still play? Nobody knew. And nobody had seen him touch a piano. Not once. The answer remained hidden. For now. Yet with every passing day, the curiosity inside the conservatory continued growing stronger. Because the more people learned about the quiet janitor, the harder it became to believe that his story was truly over. The closer the gala came, the harder it became for anyone at the conservatory to focus only on music. The mystery surrounding the janitor had taken on a life of its own. Students who had never spoken to him before now greeted him in the hallways. Some offered to help carry supplies. Others tried starting conversations just to learn more about his past. But the older man remained the same. He was polite, friendly, quiet, and careful not to talk much about himself. The more he avoided the attention, the more curious everyone became. One afternoon, several students gathered in an empty practice room after class. The newspaper articles lay spread across a table. I still can't believe it, one said. Neither can I. If he was really that famous, why would he disappear? That's what nobody knows. The student who had first discovered the articles leaned back in his chair. There has to be more to the story. Everyone agreed. The information they had found explained who the janitor had once been. But it did not explain why he walked away from everything. A few days later, another clue appeared unexpectedly. The retired professor who had recognized the pianist in the old newspaper returned to the conservatory archives. Unlike the students, he knew where to look. Years earlier, local newspapers had often covered concerts, interviews, and community events. Many records still existed in storage boxes and digital archives. The professor spent nearly an entire afternoon searching. When he finally found what he was looking for, he sat silently for several minutes. The story was much sadder than he expected. The next morning, he requested a private meeting with the conservatory director. Inside the director's office, he placed several documents on the desk. The director carefully read them. As she turned each page, her expression slowly changed. By the end, the room had become completely silent. "So it's true," she said quietly. The professor nodded. "It appears so." The director looked down at the papers again. 4 years the janitor had worked in the same building. Yet almost nobody knew what had happened to him. Now the truth was finally coming into view. Word spread quickly among the faculty. Not every detail became public, but enough information reached the students to paint a picture. Many years ago, when the pianist's career was at its peak, tragedy struck. A serious car accident changed everything. His wife had been with him. The loss shattered his world. He survived physically, but his hands were injured. Doctors were uncertain whether he would ever perform at the same level again. The combination of grief and injury pushed him away from the stage. Concert invitations stopped. Public appearances ended. Interviews disappeared. Gradually he withdrew from the music world altogether. Nobody knew exactly how long it took. But eventually he stepped away from the career he had spent his entire life building. For many students, hearing the story changed everything. The newspaper articles had been interesting. The human story behind them was something else entirely. Now they understood why sadness sometimes appeared in his eyes when he looked at a piano. Now they understood why he never bragged about his past. Now they understood why he seemed completely comfortable living a quiet life. The young pianist who had made the joke struggled with the news more than anyone. The story stayed in her mind constantly. One evening after practice, she sat alone in the auditorium. The stage lights were off. Only a few dim lights remained. The grand piano stood silently in the darkness. She thought about the first day she had laughed. She thought about how easily she had judged someone based on a uniform. Most of all, she thought about everything he had lost. For the first time, she began seeing him not as the janitor. Not even as the former pianist. She saw him as a person who had experienced pain, disappointment, and change. Someone whose life had not gone according to plan. The realization stayed with her. The next day she found him organizing equipment backstage. "Can we talk?" she asked. The older man smiled. "Of course." For a moment she struggled to find the right words. Then she spoke honestly. "I keep thinking about what happened to you." The janitor remained quiet. "I didn't know your story. Most people would have responded with details. He didn't. Instead, he simply nodded. Most people don't." She looked down. "I'm sorry for what you've been through." The older man's expression softened. "Thank you." Neither spoke for several seconds. Then she asked something she had been wondering for days. "Do you miss it?" He immediately knew what she meant. "The music." She nodded. A small smile appeared on his face. "Every day." The answer carried no bitterness, just truth. The young pianist expected him to say more. Instead, he returned to arranging equipment. Yet those two words stayed with her long after the conversation ended. Every day. Not occasionally. Not sometimes. Every day. A few days before the gala, another event sparked even more discussion. A piano instructor called in sick unexpectedly. One of the practice rooms remained empty during the afternoon. Several students happened to be passing nearby when they heard music coming from inside. Not loud. Very soft. Almost like someone warming up. The sound lasted only a minute. Maybe less. When the students opened the door, the room was empty. No teacher. No student. Nobody. The piano lid remained open. The bench sat slightly pushed back. As if someone had just left. The students exchanged confused looks. News of the strange moment spread quickly. Some became convinced the janitor had been inside. Others dismissed it as imagination. No one could prove anything. But the story only added fuel to the growing mystery. Could he still play? That question now echoed throughout the conservatory. Even teachers discussed it. One afternoon, several faculty members gathered in the staff lounge. The conversation eventually turned toward the janitor. "I wonder if he still performs privately." "I doubt it." "Why?" "It has been decades." The retired professor shook his head. "Talent like that doesn't simply disappear." Another instructor looked thoughtful. "Maybe not. But performing and practicing are different things." The professor smiled. "Perhaps." The discussion ended without answers. Just like every other conversation, nobody knew the truth. Yet something interesting was happening. The janitor himself seemed aware of all the attention. Students noticed him smiling whenever conversations suddenly stopped as he approached. It was almost as if he found the situation amusing. Still, he never confirmed anything, never denied anything. He simply continued working. Then, 3 days before the gala, an unexpected problem struck. The conservatory received terrible news. A guest performer scheduled to appear during the event had canceled. The announcement created immediate concern. The performer had been one of the evening's featured attractions. Tickets had already been sold. Advertisements had already been printed. Replacing someone at the last minute would be difficult. The director spent hours making phone calls. Teachers offered suggestions. Staff members searched for alternatives. Nothing seemed to work. Everyone qualified was already booked elsewhere. The gala suddenly faced a serious challenge. Students discussed the situation non-stop. Ideas flew from every direction. Some realistic, some ridiculous. Then someone made a suggestion that immediately captured everyone's attention. It happened during lunch. A group of students sat discussing the cancellation. One person joked, "Maybe the janitor can replace the performer." Normally everyone would have laughed. This time nobody did. Instead, the table grew quiet. The student who had first discovered the newspaper articles slowly looked around. What if he could? The question hung in the air. Several students exchanged glances. For the first time, the idea did not sound impossible. In fact, it sounded surprisingly reasonable. Within hours, the suggestion reached teachers, then staff members, then eventually the director herself. Most dismissed it immediately. Others weren't so sure. The retired professor listened carefully before speaking. "I know it sounds unusual," he said, "but if he is the musician I remember, the audience would never forget it." The room fell silent. The possibility suddenly felt real. Very real. For the first time since the mystery began, people stopped asking whether he could still play. Instead, they started asking a different question. Would he agree to try? And somewhere in the building, completely unaware of the discussion unfolding around him, the quiet janitor continued his evening work. But his peaceful routine was about to change. Because after years of avoiding the spotlight, the stage was beginning to call his name once again. The idea sounded impossible at first. A janitor performing at the conservatory's biggest event of the year? Many people immediately rejected it. Others couldn't stop thinking about it. The gala was only a few days away, and the cancellation of the guest performer had left a large gap in the program. Every solution seemed to create new problems. The director spent hours reviewing options. None of them felt right. Late one afternoon, several faculty members gathered in the conference room once again. Papers covered the table. Schedules had been revised multiple times. Everyone looked tired. The retired professor sat quietly near the end of the table. Finally, the director sighed. "We need a replacement." No one disagreed. "We've contacted everyone available." Still no disagreement. "And we're running out of time." The room remained silent. Then the professor spoke. "What about him?" Nobody needed to ask who he meant. Several people exchanged nervous looks. One instructor shook her head immediately. "That's a huge risk." "Perhaps." "What if he refuses?" "Then he refuses." Another teacher leaned forward. "And what if he accepts but hasn't played seriously in years?" The professor smiled slightly. "Then we'll find out." The discussion continued for nearly an hour. Arguments came from both sides. Some believed the idea was unrealistic. Others felt it was worth considering. Eventually, the director made a decision. There was only one way to know. Someone needed to ask him. The following morning, the janitor arrived before sunrise, as usual. The building was quiet. Most students were still asleep. He unlocked doors, checked supplies, and began his routine. To him, it felt like every other day, until he received an unexpected message. The director wanted to speak with him. He seemed surprised but agreed. A short time later, he entered the office. The director greeted him warmly. "Thank you for coming." "Of course." She invited him to sit. For a few moments they discussed ordinary matters. The upcoming gala, the busy schedule, preparations around the building. Then the conversation shifted. The director folded her hands together. "There is something I wanted to ask." The janitor nodded politely. "I'm listening." She took a careful breath. "Would you consider participating in the gala?" For the first time since entering the office, the older man looked genuinely surprised. Participating? As a performer? The room became very quiet. The janitor stared at her for several seconds, as if making sure he had heard correctly. Then he laughed softly. Not a mocking laugh. A surprised one. "I think you've asked the wrong person." "I don't believe I have." The smile slowly faded from his face. The director could see memories passing through his mind. Years of memories. Some happy, some painful. He looked toward the office window. Outside, students crossed the courtyard carrying music folders. Life continued as normal. Inside the room, however, something important was happening. Finally he spoke. "No." The answer came gently, without anger, without hesitation, just a simple refusal. The director nodded. She had expected it. Still, she wasn't ready to give up. "May I ask why?" The janitor smiled sadly. "Because that chapter of my life ended a long time ago. Perhaps. But some chapters deserve to remain closed." The director listened carefully. She understood he wasn't simply rejecting an invitation. He was protecting something deeper. Maybe old memories. Maybe old wounds. Maybe both. She chose her next words carefully. "The students admire you." The janitor looked surprised again. "They do. More than you realize." He lowered his eyes. For a moment neither spoke. Then he stood. "Thank you for asking." The director knew the conversation was over. At least for now. As he left the office, she couldn't help feeling disappointed. Not because the gala needed a performer. Because she sensed he still loved music. And she wondered if he was denying himself something he secretly missed. The news of his refusal spread quickly. Students felt disappointed. Some had already started imagining what it would be like to hear him perform. Others weren't surprised. After everything he had experienced, refusing made sense. The young pianist who had once joked about marrying him if he could play found herself thinking about the situation constantly. The more she learned about him, the more she respected him. That afternoon she found him cleaning near the auditorium. He was adjusting chairs before an evening rehearsal. She approached carefully. "I heard what happened." The janitor smiled. "People seem to hear everything around here." She laughed softly. "That's true." For a moment they worked together in silence, arranging chairs. Then she spoke. "Why won't you do it?" The older man continued working. "I haven't performed in a very long time." "That doesn't mean you can't." He paused. "You make it sound simple. Isn't it?" A small smile appeared on his face. "No." The answer carried years of experience. She waited. Eventually he continued. "When people hear music, they think about notes." She listened carefully. "But music is connected to memories." His voice remained calm. "Sometimes beautiful memories." He adjusted another chair. "Sometimes difficult ones." The young pianist understood immediately. This wasn't about fear of performing. It was about everything performing reminded him of. His former life, his dreams, his loss. The stage wasn't just a stage. It was a doorway into the past. For the first time she fully understood his refusal. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that he still belonged at a piano. Over the next 2 days, the gala preparations intensified. The building became busier than ever. Workers decorated hallways. Students practiced late into the evening. Teachers reviewed final schedules. Despite all the activity, one topic continued appearing in conversations. The janitor. Would he change his mind? Nobody knew. Then something unexpected happened. Late one evening, after most people had gone home, the retired professor remained in the building finishing paperwork. As he walked past the auditorium, he noticed a light glowing faintly inside. Curious, he stepped closer. The room was nearly dark. Only a single lamp illuminated part of the stage. At first he thought someone had forgotten to turn it off. Then he heard it. Music. Soft. Gentle. Beautiful. The professor froze. The sound drifted through the empty auditorium. Every note carried warmth and emotion. No audience. No applause. Just music. The professor quietly moved toward the doorway. He didn't want to interrupt. From a distance he could see the stage. And there, sitting alone at the grand piano, was the janitor. The older man's back faced the auditorium. He had no idea anyone was listening. His hands moved across the keys with natural ease. Not perfectly. Not like a young virtuoso trying to impress a crowd. Something better. Something honest. The music felt alive. The professor stood silently. He remembered hearing that same touch decades earlier. The same ability to make simple notes feel meaningful. For several minutes he listened. Then, without warning, the music stopped. The janitor remained seated. His hands rested on the keys. The room fell silent. Slowly he closed the piano lid. Then he stood and walked away. The professor never revealed himself. He simply watched from the shadows. A smile appeared on his face. The mystery was finally solved. The janitor could still play. Very well. The next morning the professor requested another meeting with the director. This time he brought only one message. Ask him again. The director looked surprised. You heard him? The professor nodded. Last night. And a smile spread across his face. The answer came immediately. The music never left him. The director sat quietly. Hope returned. Perhaps the first conversation wasn't the end after all. Perhaps it had only been the beginning. Because somewhere beneath years of silence, grief, and distance from the stage, the musician still existed. And now more than ever, it seemed the stage was waiting for him. The question was no longer whether he could perform. The question was whether he would allow himself to perform. And with the gala only one day away, the answer would soon change everything. The morning of the gala arrived with excitement and nervous energy filling every corner of the conservatory. Students rushed through hallways carrying instruments and garment bags. Teachers reviewed schedules one final time. Volunteers checked decorations, seating charts, and lighting equipment. Months of preparation had led to this day. By evening, the grand hall would be filled with guests. Everyone wanted everything to be perfect. Yet beneath all the normal excitement, another question continued hanging over the conservatory. Would the janitor perform? No official announcement had been made. No posters mentioned his name. No one knew what decision he had made after the director's second request. Throughout the day, students kept watching for clues. But the older man behaved exactly as he always did. He cleaned hallways, arranged chairs, helped move equipment. If he was planning something, he gave no sign. As afternoon turned into evening, guests began arriving. Luxury cars pulled up outside the conservatory entrance. Donors, community leaders, former students, and music lovers entered the building. The atmosphere felt elegant and exciting. Inside the grand hall, every seat gradually filled. Soft conversations echoed throughout the room. The stage glowed beneath warm lights. At its center stood the grand piano. Beautiful, silent, waiting. Backstage, performers prepared for their appearances. Some practiced difficult passages one last time. Others sat quietly trying to calm their nerves. The young pianist adjusted her concert attire and looked toward the stage entrance. Normally she would be focused entirely on her own performance. Tonight was different. Her thoughts kept returning to the janitor. She had not seen him all evening. That felt unusual. Finally, the program began. The director welcomed everyone. The audience applauded warmly. Then the performances started. One by one, students took the stage. The music was wonderful. Piano solos, string ensembles, vocal performances. Every act received enthusiastic applause. The evening moved smoothly. Yet there remained an empty space in the program where the cancelled guest performer had originally been scheduled. As that moment approached, whispers began spreading through the audience. Some people noticed the adjustment. Others checked their programs. Backstage, several students exchanged nervous glances. They still didn't know what would happen. Then the director walked onto the stage once again. The hall gradually became quiet. She smiled at the audience. "Before our final performances this evening," she began, "I would like to introduce someone very special." The room listened attentively. "This person has been part of our conservatory family for many years." A few students immediately knew where this was going. Their hearts started beating faster. The director continued, "Most of you may not know his story." The audience remained silent. But sometimes extraordinary people stand right beside us, and we fail to recognize them. Several guests looked confused. Others leaned forward. The director took a slow breath. "Tonight, I would like to invite one of those people onto this stage." She turned toward the side entrance. For a moment nothing happened. Then a familiar figure appeared. A quiet murmur swept across the audience. The janitor slowly walked onto the stage. Many guests looked puzzled. Some thought there must be a mistake. Others glanced at one another in confusion. The students, however, watched with complete attention. The older man seemed slightly uncomfortable beneath the spotlight. He wore a simple dark suit instead of his work uniform. Yet he still carried the same calm expression. The audience offered polite applause. Nothing more. Most people still had no idea who he was. The director smiled warmly. Then she stepped closer to him. "Thank you for being here." The janitor nodded. The director turned back toward the audience. "Many years ago, before joining our staff, he performed in concert halls across the country." Whispers immediately spread. The audience suddenly became more interested. "He has not appeared on a stage like this in decades." The hall grew quieter. The director stepped aside. The spotlight now belonged entirely to the older man. For several seconds he stood motionless, looking at the audience, looking at the stage, looking at the piano. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Then he slowly walked toward the instrument. Every step seemed meaningful, as if he were crossing more than a stage, as if he were crossing years of memories. The young pianist watched from backstage. She could see emotion in his face. Not fear. Something deeper. Something personal. The janitor reached the piano bench. For a moment he simply stood there. His hand rested lightly on the polished surface. The hall remained silent. Then he sat down. The audience waited. The students waited. The teachers waited. Even the director seemed nervous. The older man placed his hands above the keys. For one brief second, the entire room felt frozen. Then the first note sounded. Soft, clear, beautiful. A second note followed. Then another. The melody unfolded slowly. There was nothing flashy about it. No dramatic beginning. No attempt to impress anyone. Just music. Honest music. Within moments, something remarkable happened. The audience stopped seeing a janitor. They stopped seeing an older man. They stopped thinking about titles or jobs. They simply listened. The melody grew richer, warmer, full of emotion. Every note seemed connected to a memory. Every phrase felt like part of a story. The hall became completely still. People leaned forward in their seats. Some closed their eyes. Others watched his hands in amazement. The retired professor smiled quietly. He had expected something special. Even he seemed moved. As the performance continued, the music shifted. Gentle passages gave way to powerful moments. Then softness returned again. The contrast felt natural, like chapters in a life, like joy and sorrow speaking through the same instrument. The young pianist felt a lump forming in her throat. She had spent years studying technique, years chasing perfection. Yet what she heard now was something different. This performance wasn't about perfection. It was about truth. The audience felt it too. A woman in the front row wiped away tears. A donor who had spent the evening checking messages on his phone now sat completely focused on the stage. Several students stared in disbelief. The janitor's hands moved with confidence. Not the confidence of someone trying to prove himself. The confidence of someone who had finally stopped needing to prove anything. Minute after minute passed. Nobody wanted the music to end. Then came the final section. The melody became softer, more reflective. The hall felt almost sacred. Every note seemed to float through the room. The older man looked completely at peace, as though he had forgotten about the audience, forgotten about the spotlight, forgotten about everything except the music. The final notes arrived slowly, one after another, then silence. His hands lifted gently from the keys. The last sound faded into the hall. For a brief moment, nobody moved. The audience simply sat there, absorbing what they had just experienced. Then someone stood. A single person. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire hall rose to its feet. Applause exploded through the room. The sound was overwhelming. People clapped, cheered, smiled. Some wiped away tears. The standing ovation continued, and continued, and continued. The older man looked stunned. He had expected polite applause. Nothing more. Instead, he found hundreds of people standing before him, honoring not only the performance, but the journey behind it. The audience seemed unwilling to stop. The applause echoed throughout the hall. Backstage, students joined in. Teachers joined in. Volunteers joined in. The young pianist felt tears in her eyes. Not because of the music alone, because she remembered the joke she had made only days earlier. The memory felt very different now. She had looked at a uniform and assumed she understood a person. Tonight she realized how wrong that assumption had been. The standing ovation continued for several minutes. Finally, the older man stood from the piano bench. He offered a small bow. The audience answered with even louder applause. At that moment, nobody in the room saw him as the janitor. They saw him as a musician, a remarkable one, a man who had carried his gift quietly for years, a man who had endured loss and change, a man who had stepped back onto a stage when nobody expected it. As he slowly walked away from the piano, the applause followed him. And deep down, everyone in the hall understood they had witnessed something far greater than a performance. They had witnessed a return that would soon reach far beyond the walls of the conservatory. Because by morning, the entire world would begin hearing the story of the janitor who sat down at a piano and reminded everyone that true greatness never truly disappears. The morning after the gala felt different. The conservatory was still standing where it had always stood. The same classrooms, the same hallways, the same grand piano resting quietly inside the auditorium. Yet something had changed. Students arriving for morning classes immediately noticed it. Groups gathered around phones. Teachers discussed it in the staff lounge. Office workers talked about it near the front desk. The performance had become the only thing anyone wanted to discuss. Several audience members had recorded parts of the evening. Those videos had already begun spreading online. One clip showed the janitor walking toward the piano. Another captured the standing ovation. The most popular videos focused on the music itself. People who had never visited the conservatory were suddenly watching. Thousands of views became tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. The numbers continued climbing. Comments poured in from around the world. Many viewers were moved by the story. Others focused on the music. Some couldn't believe a man who worked quietly behind the scenes had once been a celebrated pianist. Most agreed on one thing. The performance felt genuine. In a world full of noise, people recognized honesty when they heard it. Inside the conservatory, the attention created an unusual situation. The janitor arrived for work expecting a normal day. Instead, he found students greeting him everywhere. People smiled as he walked past. Some applauded jokingly. Others simply thanked him. The older man seemed slightly embarrassed by all of it. He had never wanted fame. He had never asked for attention. The performance had happened because he finally allowed himself to sit at a piano again. Nothing more. At least that was how he saw it. The rest of the world saw something different. They saw a remarkable story. A story about talent. A story about resilience. A story about not giving up on something you love. Throughout the week, messages continued arriving. Former musicians who had known him decades earlier reached out. Old colleagues sent letters and emails. Some had spent years wondering what happened to him. Others had assumed they would never hear from him again. Now they wanted to reconnect. The retired professor smiled every time a new message arrived. "You deserve this," he told him. The older man shook his head. "I already have everything I need." The professor laughed. "You've always been stubborn." Probably. Yet despite his modesty, the attention brought something unexpected. Opportunities. Several music organizations invited him to perform. Local newspapers requested interviews. Community groups asked him to speak about his experiences. At first he declined almost everything. The spotlight still felt uncomfortable. But gradually he accepted a few invitations. Not because he wanted recognition, because he realized his story might help others. Meanwhile, the young pianist found herself changing in ways she had not expected. Before the gala, she had measured success through applause, trophies, and competition results. Now she saw things differently. The performance had taught her something important. Music was not about proving you were better than someone else. It was about connecting with people. It was about honesty. One afternoon she found the janitor sitting alone in the courtyard during lunch. The weather was pleasant. Students crossed the campus carrying books and instruments. For a moment she simply stood there. Then she walked over. "May I sit here?" The older man smiled. "Of course." She sat beside him. For several seconds neither spoke. Finally she took a deep breath. "There is something I've wanted to say." The janitor looked at her kindly. She smiled nervously. "A real apology this time." He laughed softly. "You already apologized." "Not properly." The older man waited. The young pianist looked down. "When I made that joke, I thought I understood who you were." She paused. "But I didn't." The janitor remained silent. "I judged you based on your job." She shook her head. "And that's something I regret." The older man listened carefully. Then he smiled. "The important thing is that you learned from it." She looked up. "You're not angry?" "Why would I be?" "Because I was disrespectful." The older man glanced across the courtyard. For a moment he seemed lost in thought. Then he answered, "Everyone sees only part of another person's story." His voice was calm. "The mistake is believing you've seen the whole thing." The young pianist nodded slowly. The words stayed with her. They felt simple, yet powerful. That conversation marked the beginning of an unexpected friendship. Over the following months they often talked between rehearsals and classes. Sometimes about music. Sometimes about life. Sometimes about nothing important at all. The young pianist discovered that the older man's greatest lessons rarely involved piano technique. Instead he spoke about patience, humility, perseverance, the qualities that mattered both inside and outside music. Word of his story continued spreading. More visitors came to the conservatory hoping to meet him. Some wanted photographs. Others wanted advice. A few simply wanted to shake his hand. The attention gradually settled down, but one lasting change remained. Students began looking at people differently. The janitor's story had reminded everyone that titles rarely tell the whole truth. The quiet person in the corner might have an incredible history. The worker cleaning the floor might have overcome challenges nobody else could imagine. The lesson reached far beyond music. Months later, the conservatory director approached him with a proposal. It happened after a student recital. The auditorium had nearly emptied. Only a few people remained. The director sat beside him. "I have an idea." The older man smiled. "That sounds dangerous." She laughed. Maybe. Then she explained. The conservatory wanted to start a mentorship program, not focused only on technical skill, focused on personal growth, confidence, resilience, helping young musicians navigate challenges. And she wanted him involved. The older man listened quietly. At first he seemed unsure. Then he thought about the students, their dreams, their fears, their pressure to succeed. Finally he agreed. The program quickly became one of the conservatory's most popular activities. Students signed up eagerly. Some expected piano lessons. What they received was something much deeper. Stories, wisdom, perspective. The older man often reminded them that setbacks were not the end of a journey. Life rarely moved in a straight line. Dreams changed, plans changed, people changed, yet meaning could still be found along the way. Those lessons stayed with many students long after graduation. Years passed. New classes entered the conservatory. Older students moved on. Teachers retired. Buildings were renovated. Life continued moving forward. But one story never disappeared. Every new group of students eventually heard it. The story of the janitor who once worked quietly behind the scenes. The story of the forgotten pianist. The story of the gala that changed everything. Some versions became exaggerated over time. Stories often do. Yet the heart of the story remained true. People remembered the standing ovation. They remembered the performance. Most of all, they remembered the lesson. One evening, many years later, a new student stood beside the grand piano after hearing the story for the first time. The student looked toward an older photograph displayed in the hallway. It showed the former janitor smiling beside a group of students. "Is the story really true?" the student asked. The teacher smiled. "Every word." The student looked surprised. "Even the part about the joke?" The teacher laughed. "Especially that part." The student glanced toward the piano. "It sounds unbelievable." The teacher nodded. "Sometimes the best stories are." And perhaps that was why people continued sharing it. Not because it was a story about music. Not because it was a story about fame. But because it was a reminder. A reminder that greatness can exist in unexpected places. A reminder that every person carries a story nobody else can fully see. And a reminder that one careless joke, one unexpected performance, and one second chance can completely change the way people see the world. The man who once quietly cleaned the halls never planned to become an inspiration. Yet somehow he did. Not through fame, not through attention, but through kindness, humility, and the courage to sit down at a piano one more time. And long after the applause faded, that became the part people remembered most.